Welcome to the deep dive of Key to My Research, the science podcast by the Excellence Strategy at the University of Tübingen. My name is Jennifer and I'm your host. In this episode, Dr. Michaela Dippold is joining us. Since 2021, she has been a professor for Geo-Biosphere Interactions at the Department of Geosciences at the University of Tübingen. Welcome.
Thanks a lot.
So we'll start off by getting to know you. Could you briefly explain what is it you do at the Department of Geosciences?
At the Department of Geoscience, I'm leading the working group for Geo-Biosphere Interaction. This working group tackles the interaction of all the living components of the Earth system, the biosphere, with everything that is non-living, all the abiotic components, the geosphere. And one of the key targets, therefore, is the soil, where plants interact with the minerals.
Mm-hmm. You just talked about the geosphere and the biosphere. These are really two very important spheres we will be talking about a lot. So could you just please define both in very simple terms?
So the biosphere is all the living components of that planet that comprises the elements we see, the animals, the plants, but a lot of the biosphere is invisible for us, and this is the microbial world. So, for example, our body consists of more microbial cells than of human cells, and similar, it's everywhere in the environment. But all these living components live in their environment, which consists of many abiotic components. And this is the minerals they are living on, they are feeding on. This comprises the water, the air that is surrounding them, and all these abiotic components, they comprise the geosphere.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you are really doing research in a field that is invisible to us. Would that be correct?
I think we see it every day, but we don't see all the components. Many of them are hidden to our eyes, and many of them require highly advanced techniques to tackle how they interact with each other, which is the critical point. So we see the plants and we see the soil, but the interaction between the plant and the soil, which is so key for everything from food production to carbon storage, this is something we need to tackle with very modern techniques which make that visible.
We'll learn more about the techniques later, but I'd just like to know a bit more about your career path. So what led you to the University of Tübingen and what made you become a professor?
The topic itself fascinated me from the beginning of my life. So I grew up on a farm where I was taught from the beginning that what is the source of our life and that food production is essential and that the soil is the source of our food production. And by that, I started to study geoecology with a focus on soil science. So I studied at the University of Bayreuth, where I studied geoecology. Then I went to the University of Göttingen, where I was for several years in an agricultural faculty, really working in the field of agriculture. But then I was attracted back to the geoscience and the geoecology by the University of Tübingen and ended up here on this newly founded full professorship.
You grew up on a farm. Can you tell us a bit what life was like as a child growing up in a farm? That's quite a romantic sort of picture that comes up in my head.
Oh, I think the picture is pretty correct. I played with tractors and cows, and I grew up in the dirt, which I started to value then very, very early. So I played with it as a child and I work with it now as an adult. And this dealing on a daily basis with the soil, I think this definitely had an imprint on my life, yeah.
And did you ever contemplate being in agriculture yourself on a farm?
Oh yeah, I would say that was never out of the options at the beginning of my life. And I'm still very tightly bound to the farm at home. But at a certain point, these small family farms, they give only life to one family. And if only one of us could decide to stay there. And I found my passion also in really understanding what's going on and not only in doing it in a daily life. And also I still like farming, I have to say. I also like digging a soil profile, do research on it.
And was there any key moment when you decided I'm going to go into science and specifically I'm going to go into geosciences?
In the last years, at school, I focused already on geoscience as a major subject. And I had a physical geographer as teacher who loved soils, interestingly, and who fascinated me for that. So I just decided to dive into that a little more when studying. And studying in Bayreuth was at this time strongly soil-centered and really strengthened me in that wish to focus on this really complex topic in the environment. So also from all the subjects in the environment, the soil seems for me the one where we know the least. And everything where we know the least always fascinated me all over my life. So I decided that, it has to be soil science.
So from your career path, we'll get to talk about the current research projects you're working on and what their goals are. Can you just give us a little picture of what you're doing at the moment?
Oh, at the moment, I'm working relatively broadly in various fields of geoscience. So they are all a bit related to soil science, but they last from agriculture to carbon capture studies in soils. They also look on fire impacts on ecosystem nutrient dynamics. So the range is pretty broad, related to everything that goes about biogeochemistry, so how the different elements cycle through the environment, up to what role plants and microbes play in these cycles.
So this spans a very big and vast field. What would be the research project which is currently your favorite?
From all the projects, I wouldn't say I have a favorite, but the one with the highest impact and where the outcomes are the most essential to achieve them now is presumably the rhizosphere research on crops in very drought-prone areas which are strongly affected by climate change.
Okay, so let's talk high impact first. What does this long-term or long sort of research title mean? What is it you do there?
I'm looking at crops which may be able to produce yield even if climate change aggravates the production conditions in some areas of the globe dramatically. And dramatic impacts we will definitely have in the tropics. Large parts of the tropics will suffer from strongly increasing droughts. The droughts will be more abundant, the droughts will be more severe. And the crop production there is at the moment not adapted to that, because the crop production went from very traditional crops to crops which have a potential to be sold on markets. And these crops are not those which are the most resistant or robust to the climate change that we may expect. They need a better adaptation to use the resources below ground. That is one of the major points, and that is the point where my research focus lies. Because water uptake, nutrient uptake, all this occurs by the roots. And the roots need the adaptations to deal with drier soils, with soils which start to get nutrient depleted due to the droughts where nutrients are less available. And roots and soil traditionally interact in many ways, and modern breeding did not look at these ways at all, because you can't easily look below ground. You can easily see the leaves, you optimize the leaves, you are breeding with high fertilizer input under ideal conditions. You never look under production under marginal conditions.
Mm-hmm. And how can you actually look at these roots and the processes and interactions which are happening below ground?
So one of the ways how we tackle that is, for example, that we grow plants in rhizoboxes. So in these boxes, the plants are forced to grow with their roots along a glass plate, where you can visualize them, but also which you can open. And then you can do various visualization approaches at them. And you can visualize the microbes which are next to the roots, or you can visualize the nutrient uptake pathways, the nutrient uptake hotspots. So there is various techniques by which we can see what is going on at this interface of the root to the soil. And this is key to understand what would be our target in preparing the crops for the future.
Do you have any first outcomes or findings regarding the target?
So one of the key targets we need to look at is mycorrhizal. So there is a very ancient symbiosis between plant and fungi. So this lasts back to the first plant coming from the water to the earth, to the land, which did not have roots at all, but which only took up their nutrients by the fungi, which was interacting with the plant. And this symbiosis still exists, and it's there for 80% of the plants that we can see. Nearly all crops have it. And this symbiosis helps especially under drought. And one of our key outcomes was that the symbiosis may always be there, but only under drought, the symbiosis starts to become active. And it starts to really supply the plant with the nutrients it needs and which it cannot take up by itself anymore if the soil is completely dried out. But the fungi is still active.
Okay, what we can sum up is that plants can only make it with sort of partners. So who are the friendliest or best allies of plants when it comes to adapting or to growing, surviving, developing?
I think mycorrhizal fungi are definitely one of the keys. They are not the only ones, so they also do not work on their own. That is the very interesting thing. So there are many bacteria, so a magnitude of bacteria around the roots. It's the similar thing than with our body. Yeah? Around the root is magnitude more of bacterial cells than there are root cells. They all interact with the plant and they all interact also with the fungi. So the system is really complex that is going on there. And the moment the system is stressed, because, for example, drought appears or a heat wave comes or any of these disturbances that global change will bring with higher abundance, these stresses induce shifts in the system and kind of rescue mechanisms start that enable or maintain the plant staying alive through these periods where real growth is not possible anymore.
And you said you had been looking at crops and plants in foreign countries. Have you also been looking at them in Europe or Germany?
Oh, yes. I also look at them here. The viewpoint here is a bit a different one because the soils in the tropics, they are very depleted in nutrients. So there we always look at, okay, how can we support the plants in nutrient and water uptake? This is not a problem in Germany. We have very fertile soils here. Our crops are very well adapted. If I look here into crops, one of my key targets is, for example, also, okay, what can we do to get our relatively high productive crops more resistant to drought in terms of how can we make them get access to water resources in the soil which are still there if our topsoil is dried out. And one of the main points here that I look at is deep rooting of crops because the soil dries always out from the top. So the subsoil stays moist. So deep-rooting crops still have access to the resources that they need for growth if our topsoils are dried out.
Mm-hmm. But wouldn't this be a kind of sort of interim solutions because the water levels, they might keep sinking or the access to water might get more and more difficult? Are we still in the sort of time plan if we do this kind of research?
I think with this kind of research, we can still maintain productivity. Productivity is not the problem that we will face here in Germany. We need to adapt, we need to change a bit, we need to go from looking at the maximum yield at every year to having constant yields also in the years which have catastrophic conditions, which are far too moist or which are far too dry or which are far too cold. So our viewpoint needs to change, but then we can maintain the productivity of our soil. The question is more, can we maintain it in an environmental friendly way? So the viewpoint is really different in the tropics where every piece of food is needed, and here where we should not only look on the maximum productivity, but also on, okay, how can we maintain that productivity for future generations? How can we maintain our soils fertile for the next generations?
Okay, so I've got an understanding of what you're doing here in Europe with the current conditions, but what are you looking at in the tropics? Is deep rooting a solution there, or what other methods or concepts are you looking at there?
Deep rooting is one of the strategies. Long-term improvement of soil fertility is also one of the strategies because the soils there are naturally much less fertile. So many measures that work well for us, but they don't bring an immediate yield increase or don't bring yield stability, have a much higher effect in the tropics. So, for example, biochar is one of these examples. So the production of basically charcoal or charred material out of residues, which improves soil fertility, is a traditional measure which already the Indios in the Amazon used to improve their soil fertility, and which may have a huge impact and help a lot in tropical farming to make the soils more fertile, and by that also sustain productivity even under aggravating conditions.
I read an interesting fact about the rainforest growing on very infertile soil, but being the biggest biomass globally. How does that come? How does that work?
Yeah, that's indeed an interesting phenomena we observe. And the answer to that is, so we are coming somehow back to where we started, is again mycorrhizal. So these soils, they are very old. By that, they lost over the thousands of years all their nutrient stocks. So the climatic conditions there are ideal. It's raining on a daily basis, so there's no water scarcity, but there's no nutrients. So to keep a high biomass upright, you need to close the nutrient cycles to 100%. You cannot lose any nitrogen. You cannot lose any phosphorus. And for that, mycorrhiza has a key role there. So every leaf that's falling down from a tropical tree has a mycorrhizal hyphal network growing under it within the first hours that it touches the soil. And these hyphae make a so dense network that every nutrient that is released from that leaf during it is decomposing is caught and immediately transported by the hyphae back to the root and back to the tree. So the cycle is ideally closed. And that's a system you cannot regenerate once you have destroyed it.
And can we take any knowledge looking at the rainforest, the infertile soil, but the great biomass? Can we take any knowledge and transfer it to your research or to other countries?
For sure we can, because what I very often do is I look into the system, into the natural system, like the tropical rainforests. Now, if we need to do production there, the solution is very obvious. We need to try to close nutrient cycles as much as possible. That is the only way how we can deal there. Fertilizing is not an option because we put the fertilizers there. We have rains which are incredibly stronger than the rains we are used to. And 90% of the fertilizer is lost with the first rainfall. So to deal there, we need to capture the things in the soil or in the soil-plant cycle. And soil improvements as well as plant improvements have to go along with that. So we need plants who are able to build this mycorrhization. We need always plants there so that the network exists all the time. We need soils which are better able to capture the nutrients, for which, for example, the biochar is one solution. So many solutions we can look at the nature, and we can think about, okay, how can we transfer them to modern agriculture?
So this is a big field of your research, very interesting one. Are there any other sort of research fields or questions that you're looking at that we can talk about?
I think very closely related to that topic is the topic of using soils as a carbon reservoir, so carbon capturing in soils. It is a hot topic because we need to somehow mitigate the climate change effects as much as possible. We need to try to capture as much CO2 from the atmosphere as it's possible, and the soils are a big reservoir. So if we look on the area on land, there is 2/3 of the carbon in the soil and only 1/3 in the vegetation and the animals that we see. So the reservoir is huge, and the really good thing about the soil carbon capture is that it goes along with many other positive aspects. So all the soil improvements are related to capturing carbon in the soil. So in many other ways, when we manage the environment, we have trade-offs. We can either have the one target or the other target. In this case, storing carbon in the soil brings a lot of benefits for soil fertility, for soil health, for soil productivity, and so on. So it is closely related, but the approach is a bit a different one because we mainly look at how we can bring huge amounts of carbon into the soil.
I just ask you to briefly explain or define what soil carbon capture is before we go deeper into it.
Soil carbon capture is our attempt to increase the organic carbon content. So basically, it's the humic substance content of the soil. And to store soil organic carbon in the soil organic matter, we need to either increase the input into the soil, which we can do by adding, for example, residues after the harvest and so on, or we need to change the conditions in the soil so that we lose less of the carbon as CO2 that goes back to the atmosphere.
I was going to ask, why is it so important to capture carbon?
It is important because we need to exploit each buffer we have against the fossil CO2 emissions. So we need to compensate them on land. Terrestrial ecosystems can do that to a certain extent still. So not everything we release at the moment by fossil fuel burning really ends up in the atmosphere. And that's already a great achievement of nature on its own. But this buffer is very, very limited. And to reduce global warming, we need to actively manage the ecosystems which we have under management to increase their carbon storage potential.
So as managers of the ecosystem, like you just said, what can we actively do to help nature in this sense?
There's many different measures that go along with each other. So many of them you can already see when you go around. So I would say 10 years ago, over the winter, many of our fields were bare. Now we see winter cover cropping occurring everywhere. So over the winter, we let some crops grow, which we are plowing in spring, and they feed the soil with biomass. And this biomass is the basis for the accumulation of carbon in the soil, is one of the bases. Keeping the residues in the site is one of the others. And my research focuses on very specific ones which deal with bringing carbon not only into this upper shallow soil layer by plowing some residues in, but bringing it also deep into the soil by deep rooting crops.
And are you actually in contact with active farmers other than your family when it comes to your research?
Yes, indeed. So I am invited sometimes by farmers' associations where I give presentations about, for example, these cover crop projects, what benefit we can gain from these deep rooting cover crops, what is the benefit if we long-term accumulate more carbon and by that more nutrient stocks. So there is intensive exchange on various bases.
And what learnings can you sort of bring into agriculture, and what specific knowledge can the farmers give you, which you can't recreate in the laboratory?
The knowledge that I gain from the farmers is broad, and it helps me a lot because it often shows that solutions which are easy to be tested in a trial are not so easy to be implemented on the large area. And there are problems which range from we need a different technique to do that, to this only works with one type of soils but totally fails with other ones. You can hardly test everything in a scientific experiment. So at the end, you need the farmer's experience to feed back to you when they start to try what you recommend. They can also be range up to political issues that the system, the political system and the funding system for farmers does not support that they implement a certain measure, which showed very promising results in the scientific experiments.
So it sounds a bit like as plants need partner organizations to develop and grow, you as a scientist also need collaboration and exchange with the people on the field.
Oh, this is 100% true. So this I can fully confirm. And you need it in a continuous exchange, I would say. So it's not about, okay, we set something up, we make an experiment, we find something out, we give out a recipe. Okay, by that you can get 5% more carbon in 10 years, do this. But you need the constant feedback during experiments. So you need days where the farmers visit your fields, where they look at it and where they then directly tell you, oh, this looks good, but if you have this amount of biomass here and you're plowing it under, we will get problems with our sowing machines, because with these sowing machines, we can't deal with all this crap lying around here. And then you're there like, oh, that was a problem I haven't thought about. So you need another solution for that. And this constant exchange is essential.
So we've talked about two very interesting fields of your research. Is there any other field we should talk about now?
One other field we can touch is the disturbance ecology. So I'm looking at these severe events like droughts, not only in an agricultural context, but also how natural ecosystems deal with it. With extreme events like extreme droughts, or also other much stronger disturbances such as fires. Such disturbances strongly interrupt the cycle of systems. And I think in the tropical rainforest, where we talked already about it, is very evident what impacts this would have to interrupt everything by removing the vegetation. But in many other systems, this can have similar severe impacts. And fires, as we know from the daily press, they are increasing in many ecosystems globally with high abundance. The areas they cover are larger and larger, and the implications of them are very tough for the environment and for the people.
Mm-hmm. Are we talking about man-made fire, or are we talking about natural fires?
We talk about both natural fires and man-made fires, which are somehow related. So there is ecosystems globally which really depend on a certain degree of natural fires. But under the current conditions in all systems globally, the fire abundance and severity increase. And very often they are man-made. So systems which tend to burn under natural conditions burn now much more often. And it's very often because the fires are fires from agricultural practices or forest management practices which were lost out of control. But it's also because of camping or the phenomena we read about in the daily press. And this high intensity and high abundance of fires exceeds what the ecosystems are adapted to.
And what happens to the soil when fire comes along and burns down the vegetation?
So the soil itself suffers only in the first few millimeters. So the heat doesn't go through very intensively, but the consequences are more on a long-term basis. So in those systems which, like the tropical rainforest, have this extremely close recycling of nutrients, you take out one component of the cycle. And taking this component, the vegetation, off means the cycle is open and means the nutrients are lost. And this loss of nutrients has consequences for decades to centuries because they need to be recovered from the soil. And then it depends how rich the soil is, if it can sustain that the same vegetation grows again in a certain time, or whether the loss of nutrients really is now a limiting factor for the vegetation coming up after the fire.
And can microorganisms survive fire, or is everything wiped out?
There are specific microorganisms which are very adapted, like these fungi that love fires and appear immediately after the fire on the charcoal and cover the soils. But the very most of them are not adapted to high temperatures. But as the temperature doesn't go very deep into the soil, there is very fast a recolonization of the upper surfaces. So the microbes itself survive, but they find very different conditions. There is no plant, there is no root feeding them with whom they can interact. And this is the limitation for the conditions after the fire. And then other factors come on top. So there is no vegetation stabilizing the soil anymore. So strong rainfall events lead to huge erosion losses. And these erosion leads to the fertile layer of the soil being completely removed from the system.
And it sounds like a domino effect. When a fire destroys the vegetation, there are certain steps that follow which make the soil quality worse and worse, if I understood correctly.
Yes, this can happen. And this doesn't happen with each fire, but if we have many fires and they appear again and again, the probability that once such a chain of events really has severe consequences and the nutrient loss accumulates over each fire event, the risk for these devastating consequences increase.
Mm. I don't know if you have any answer to this question, but what plants would preferably grow on soil that has been burned? Does a vegetation shift?
There is a vegetation shift at the beginning, and the first plants that regrow are plants which are specifically adapted to fire. So some plants, especially in these regions which have a natural fire regime, there are plants who only germinate, where the seed only opens if it was heated up by a fire. This is really fascinating.
This is absolutely fascinating. I've never heard of it.
Yeah, so these plants exist, and they are the first one growing again, and they are very essential. And after these plants, the colonization starts again, and for sure the vegetation after a fire looks initially very different to what was there. But if the fire regime is in its natural balance, the vegetation will recover that was there.
And where can you find this fascinating plant or flower you were just talking about?
So you find these plants in every regions which are prone to fire. So the Mediterranean regions, for example. All the Mediterranean regions globally have these types of plants. It's not only one plant, yeah? Mm-hmm. So there is various pines, for example, yeah, which have this ability to specifically react on the fire by releasing the seed and thereafter, growing and germinating.
So your research has taken you abroad to foreign countries. Where have you been and what have you done there?
I specifically have a working focus in what we call often the countries of the global south, where the tropics, the subtropics are located in South America, for example. I worked along long climate gradients in Chile. In West Africa, I worked at the Mount Cameroon in Cameroon. I was in East Africa. I have a strong working focus in Kenya, but also work in Ethiopia. I was in Sudan before the war. I started work now in South Africa. So these countries are for sure, the center of my research.
Is there any experience from the research you've done in one of these countries that you still have very present in your mind?
So if you talk about experience which have nothing to do with research at all, definitely one of the experiences is that the happiness of people is totally independent of how rich they are. Mm. So this is an experience that I always take home whenever I'm in the tropics, and that is something that, is absolutely fascinating if you look around in our society.
From foreign countries and the experiences you've had there, we'll come to our hometown or the center of your academic research, which is Tübingen. What role does the University of Tübingen play for your scientific work?
I think for every scientist, the university plays a big role. For me, especially as with moving here, I was the first time able to really realize my research in all depths. So I got a lot of opportunities here, and the working environment here is so rich in opportunities for collaborations that the first time I have the feeling that all the targets which were restricted, I couldn't tackle in the past, all these doors are now open for my research.
And are you collaborating with any specific departments? Are they specifically enriching to you?
So I am in the Department of Geosciences, but I have strong bounds, and I think Geo-Biosphere Interactions makes that already clear with the Department of Biology. And many projects I set up with colleagues from there, and many infrastructures either we build up or which are there we jointly use.
And what is your favorite part of your job as a professor at the University of Tübingen?
My favorite part of the job is educating PhD students. So bringing somebody who has this kind of, I want to look into science, into this fascination of searching for answers. And this happiness that you see in the eyes of your PhD students when they found out something really astonishing, something really new, and they identify in their research something where they say, wow. And now I'm very close to the theory that this and this researcher once postulated. This makes you really happy.
And sort of looking into the future, as a professor at the University of Tübingen, how do you see your future in the field? What other questions would you like to tackle?
I think one of the central questions I can tackle with the colleagues here at the university is really climate change mitigation. And now I'm at the Geoscience department. So whereas before I dived a lot into agricultural management to mitigate, now the geoscience world opens new doors. For example, the ability to look into enhanced weathering as a technique. So that is using the process of mineral weathering as a process that consumes CO2 during the process, and by that binding atmospheric CO2 in a geoprocess.
Could you simply explain again what enhanced weathering encompasses?
So when soils form, they form from rocks. And rocks need to weather to build up the soil. So they disintegrate, but also by reaction with the CO2 from the atmosphere, new minerals form. And this is a process we can use artificially, we can enhance artificially. So we can use rock powder, which is prone to this weathering. We can apply it on our field sites, and we can use this rock powder to bind CO2 from the atmosphere. And this is a process that is just in its development, and it adds very nicely on many other agricultural measures to help us to use the soil as a CO2 sink.
Wow, this is a very interesting topic as well. And we've talked about so many different fields, from soil science to biogeochemistry to plant-soil interactions. And it sounds as if, there's so much happening, and the target and the goal and the relevance is so important with the ever-changing climate and the conditions. I just have one last question, which I would like to finish with. And this also concerns your research. What is the key to your research?
The key to my research is the fascination about nature. Going outdoor, enjoying what you see, and the willingness to understand the processes in the environment to be able to protect the fascination of nature.
Thank you, Professor Dippold, for this very inspirational talk today. This was Key to My Research, a podcast produced by Changing Time in cooperation with the University of Tübingen. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and recommend it to your friends and colleagues. My name is Jennifer, and I'm your host. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.